people in the Old Testament, there are just a very few people that nothing bad is said about. Daniel is one of them. Now, Daniel and Joseph are two people in the Old Testament that really doesn't say anything negative about them. Daniel, we talked about him a few weeks ago, how he purposed in his heart, Daniel chapter 1, that he would not be defiled by the king's meat. He was taken captive by King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian army. Him and his young friends were taken to Babylon. King Nebuchadnezzar tried to feed them with his food and change their names and teach them all the ways of Babylon, the Chaldeans. But Daniel and his friends determined that they would not be defiled by the king's meat. So tonight, we're going to be in Daniel chapter 2. And as I said before, Daniel chapter 2 is a very prophetic chapter, and we're going to see that when we look there. Daniel is a very prophetic book. I've said a lot of people talk about the book, the Revelation. To really understand the Revelation, you've got to understand the book of Daniel, and to understand Daniel, you've got to understand the book of Revelation, because they're both dealing with the same topic. One from the standpoint of an Old Testament Jew, another from the standpoint of a New Testament Christian, John. But they both are saying the same things. Okay, there it is. Babylon. We've all heard the name Babylon. And just to kind of refresh our minds about this. Babylon was a city that existed, 3,000 years ago. Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon. They conquered Jerusalem. They conquered the Jews. But Babylon went into decline after so many years, and today there is not a city of Babylon. There are some ruins. We'll see a picture here in a little bit, but Babylon is not just a city. It's a mindset. It really has to do with the world system. We said that Babylon had its beginnings at the Tower of Babel, Genesis chapter 11. It'll have its doom in Revelation chapter 17. It's called Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. All false religion, all of man's governments, all of man's systems that are anti-Christ really had its roots in ancient Babylon. So when we talk about Babylon, the city, we're really talking about the fountainhead of everything that is evil, even though today there is not an actual city called Babylon. Babylon exists. In fact, Babylon is the world system that we live in. Okay? Just a couple, let's see. Here's a map. Maybe I can get the little red dot to work. Yeah, okay, the red dot works. Okay, here's a map of that part of the world. Of course, here's Jerusalem there. Here's Babylon here, probably about 600 miles or so between the two. Babylon was the world power in Daniel's day. They were the power that controlled everything. There's a couple pictures that I got, if it works. Okay, go ahead, John. Here's a picture of some of the ruins of ancient Babylon. Now, it's located in what today is Iraq, where we have our fighting men. As a matter of fact, Saddam Hussein, remember him? He likened himself to a modern-day Nebuchadnezzar. He was going to try to rebuild the ancient city of Babylon. Didn't get too far. Go ahead, John, to the next picture. It's another picture of the walls. Those are some of the archaeological finds. Daniel might have walked down one of those streets that we're looking at right here. That was the city that was the world power at that time. One more click, John, go ahead. Here was the guy named Nebuchadnezzar. That was a coin that they found, an ancient coin. I guess that's what he looked like. He was the guy who was in charge of everything. He was the king. He was the power. He had conquered Egypt. He had conquered all the known nations at that time. King Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, John, go ahead to the next one. The book of Daniel has 12 chapters. Again, this is just kind of a little refresher. The first 6 chapters deal with Daniel's personal history in Babylon and how God intervened in his life there, how God helped him to find favor, much like Joseph in the book of Genesis, the end of Genesis. God helped Daniel find favor in the midst of the enemy. And we read that in chapters 1 through 6, how God worked for Daniel. In chapters 7 through 12, we're going to read a lot about, when we get there, we're going to read a lot about the prophetic visions that God gave to Daniel concerning things that are happening right now. There were things that were happening concerning the nation of Israel. The things that are happening, it has its effects right now. What we're seeing happening in the world today has its beginnings way back when, because what they're talking about there, well, I sure wish I could get this to work. Go ahead, John, click. Two phrases that you're going to hear me use a lot. Times of the Gentiles, that's a phrase that Jesus used, that we'll talk about in a minute. And another phrase, world order. How many remember Bush the First talking about a new world order, right? Well, this is not a new world order at all. It's an old world order. It's been going on for a long time, okay? But the times of the Gentiles, that's really what Daniel is about, and really what God's prophetic time clock with his history is about. The times of the Gentiles. Go ahead, John. Go to the next one. Jesus, when he was giving the sermon, the Olivet Discourse, he was telling the things that were going to be happening in the last days. And he said, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Now, when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem, that we talked about that a few weeks ago, when he conquered Jerusalem and took Daniel and his friends and others captive, that was the beginning of the times of the Gentiles. That was the beginning of the times when Jerusalem would be under control of the Gentiles, under Gentile control. It still is today, even though back in the 67 war, the Israelites took Jerusalem and they are officially in control of that entire city. Still, it's split up into the Arabic part and the Palestinian part. They're still fighting over it. So it really is, Gentiles are still exercising control over the city of Jerusalem even at this point. So the times of the Gentiles have not yet been fulfilled yet. But that's what we're going to read about tonight in Daniel chapter 2. Go ahead, John, to the next one. Let's turn to Daniel chapter 2 and read a little bit. We're going to see that King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. You ever have any bad dreams? Last night, my wife and I were eating some hot salsa, and we had bad dreams. But King Nebuchadnezzar had him a bad dream. Okay. It says in Daniel chapter 2 and verse 1. Go ahead, click forward, John. In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams wherewith his spirit was troubled and his sleep broke from him. He had a dream that troubled him. Now, John, go ahead, go back to the one before that. He had a dream that troubled him. It was a prophetic dream. And it dealt with the world order and with the times of the Gentiles. Okay? Now, somebody asked the question, well, Nebuchadnezzar was a heathen king. He was a pagan king. He worshipped other gods. He worshipped Baal, and he worshipped Marduk, and there was about 8 or 9 gods that the Babylonians worshipped. He didn't worship Yahweh of the Hebrews. He worshipped all these other gods. Why did God give him a dream? Well, for one thing, in Jeremiah, God called Nebuchadnezzar his servant. How many people know God can use anybody he wants to use? When we know the story, Jeremiah, if you read the prophet Jeremiah, Jeremiah went to his people and he pled with them, please turn from idolatry. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, all the other prophets, they would go to the people and they would say, please, turn from idolatry, because the Jews were worshiping other gods. God said, I'm your God, you should worship no other gods. But they were worshiping Shemash, and they were worshiping Baal, and they were worshiping all these other gods. And God tried to get their attention. They actually got to the place where they were offering their children in the fire to Molech. That was like the straw that broke the camel's back. And the prophets were saying, please turn from this idolatry, but they didn't want to listen. So God chose a heathen king, a pagan king, that didn't even believe in him, to be his servant. Now, we're going to find out as we read the book of Daniel, I believe that Nebuchadnezzar eventually became a believer in the God of the Hebrews, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But at this point, God was using him as a servant. I don't believe Nebuchadnezzar really had any clue that everything that was happening to him was because of God. He thought that he was a powerful king. He thought that he was a mighty general and a mighty warrior. He didn't realize that everything that was happening was because God was allowing it to happen. How many people know that nothing happens unless God allows it to happen? Okay. So Nebuchadnezzar was God's servant. Now the dream Nebuchadnezzar had that we're going to read about in a minute, it was man's viewpoint of government, okay? When man thinks about man, we're very proud and we're very arrogant. We're very proud of the things we've accomplished, mankind, humanity. We're very proud. We've put men on the moon. We've done all these magnificent works. So when man sees things, he sees them as big and shiny. This statue we're gonna read about here just a little bit is a statue, made of gold and silver and bronze and so forth. Now, when we get to the later chapters, from 7 on, we're going to see God's viewpoint. When Daniel had visions about world order and about the times of the Gentiles, he saw beasts. He saw creatures, ravenous creatures, lions and leopards and bears and creatures with iron claws. That's the way God sees human government. But when man looks at it, he gets pretty impressed. So the dream that God gives to Nebuchadnezzar, we're going to find out when we read a little bit later. Nebuchadnezzar was sitting back thinking about how great his kingdom was. And God gave him this dream. If he had given it to Daniel, nobody would have listened to him. The king wouldn't have listened to him. He would just count it as, might have cut his head off. But we're going to see as we read on in chapters, as we go on further in the next several weeks, that this is going to be part of the process of saving Nebuchadnezzar. God wanted to save Nebuchadnezzar. See, some people would just balk at that. They say, oh, Nebuchadnezzar was horrible, Antichrist. God wanted to save him. I believe God wants to save Barack Obama. God wants to save our governor. He wants to save our mayor. He wants us to pray for all men everywhere. Isn't that what it says in Timothy? Pray for those in leadership and authority that they might get saved. Well, God had a plan for Nebuchadnezzar. Go ahead, John. Go on to the next. And go one more. Okay. Let's read verse 2. He had this dream. Let's read verse 1 again. In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams wherein his spirit was troubled and his sleep broke from him. Then the king commanded to call the magicians and the astrologers and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans for to show the king his dreams. That's what the king would do. He had hired all these people to work for him. And he used these people whenever he had a problem or when he needed some advice. He would call these different ones. He called them and he said, I want you to tell me about this dream. And the king said unto them, I have dreamed a dream, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream. Now, go to the next one, John, please. There are 4 different people here. Nebuchadnezzar had 4 different kinds of people in his cabinet. He had magicians. The word really means a horoscopist. We know what a horoscope is, isn't that? The study of the stars and so forth. They were the word actually means somebody that would draw lines and circles. And if you ever saw somebody chart, I was into that at one time, the horoscope things. They would lines and circles and stars and everything. And there were the astrologers. Babylon was noted for being the kind of like the beginning of astrology. Stargazers, fortune tellers, witches. They would use drugs, enchantments. Whenever you read about sorcery in the Bible, Old or New Testament, the implication is the use of drugs, because when you take drugs, it gets you kind of like in a trance. And then the Chaldeans were the upper class philosophers. They were the ones who were really like in charge of everything. They were the wise men of Babylon. So Nebuchadnezzar called these ones. Go to the next one, John, please. And it says in verse 4, Then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac, O king, live forever, tell your servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. They said, well, king, that's our job. We interpret dreams and we tell you what's going on. Tell us what the dream is. And hey, we'll get our dream books out, and we'll let you know. And the king said, well, there's a problem. I don't remember the dream. The dream is gone from me. I don't remember it. Now, you guys are supposed to be such hot shots. Tell me the dream. That's what he said. He says, the thing is gone from me. If you will not make known unto me the dream with the interpretation thereof, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made a dunghill. Well, that can't leave too much to the imagination there. Nebuchadnezzar wanted to know about this dream. He says, but if you will show the dream and the interpretation thereof, you shall receive of me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and the interpretation thereof. Well, I don't know. If I had been one of the Chaldeans that time, I'd probably start getting a little scared, because listen what they said. They answered again, and they said, Let the king tell his servants the dream. King, well, listen, tell us the dream. We'll tell you all about it. And the king answered and said, I know of a certainty that you would gain the time, because you see the thing is gone from me. But if you will not make known unto me the dream, there is but one decree for you have prepared lying and corrupt words. Nebuchadnezzar was saying, I thought you guys were something. I thought you guys knew something. Now I give you some kind of task. You can't do it. You guys been pulling the wool over my eyes all this time. How many people know it takes God to bring revelation? Nebuchadnezzar needed a revelation, and they couldn't give it to him because they didn't know the one who gives revelation. Anybody can learn tricks of the trade. Anybody can learn all the pat answers. Anybody can get books. I can remember, I've said this before, when I was in college, there was a fellow, I knew, a good friend of mine. He was really into like horoscope stuff. Astrology. I went to visit his house. He lived down in Fredericktown, in Fredericksburg, I forget what it's called, but it's a little town right up there. And you go into his house, and he had horoscope ashtrays and horoscope posters and horoscope pictures. I mean, everything was a zodiac, zodiac, everything. And he had all these books. He said, oh, man, you got to read this book, that book. So you read these books, and you put your birthday down, and you do a little calculation there, and he says, turn to paragraph number 413, and you turn there, and it tells you something about you. Anybody can read them books, print them books up. They can say anything. But only God can give a revelation. Only God can bring revelation. He says, in verse 9, if you will not make known unto me the dream, there is but one decree for you. For you have prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me till the time be changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can show me the interpretation thereof. And the Chaldeans answered before the king and said, there's not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter. Therefore there is no king, lord, nor ruler that asks such things at any magician or astrologer, a Chaldean. And it's a rare thing that the king requires, and there is none other that can show it before the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. They had that right. The only one that could reveal anything to Nebuchadnezzar was God. And they knew it. They couldn't do it. Well, this made the king a little upset. It made him a little angry. He says in verse 12, for this cause the king was angry and very furious and commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. And the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they sought Daniel and his fellows to be slain. Because remember, we read in the last chapter how Daniel was counted because he purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's meat. Nebuchadnezzar looked upon him and his 3 friends, and he saw that they were goodly young men, so he put them in high places. So they were counted among these wise men. So their heads were on the chopping block too. Now, in verse 14 it says this. Then Daniel answered with counsel and wisdom to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, which was gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. He answered and he said to Arioch, the king's captain, why is this decree so hasty from the king? Then Arioch made the thing known to Daniel. Then Daniel went in and desired of the king that he would give him time, and that he would show the king the interpretation. Daniel promised he would show the interpretation. He didn't go into the king and he say, well, king, give me some time. Maybe I'll be able to come up with something. Maybe I'll be able to think of something, or we'll be able to figure something out. He didn't say that. He said, king, if you give me some time, I know you'll get the interpretation. Why? Because Daniel knew who his God was. Daniel knew who had the answer. Why? Because he purposed in his heart that he would not be defiled. So he had communion with the Father, with Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He knew his God. See, if Daniel had not made that decision, remember I said before, that the whole purpose of Daniel started with Daniel saying, I will not defile myself. Daniel was able to guarantee Nebuchadnezzar an answer because he knew the God that gave him the dream. He purposed in his heart not to be defiled. He promised an interpretation. He went and he prayed with his comrades, and God revealed the dream to him. Now look at verse 20. No, verse 19. Then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. He changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom unto the wise and knowledge to them that know understanding. He reveals the deep and secret things. He knows what is the darkness, and the light dwells with him. I thank thee and praise thee, O thou God of my fathers, who has given me wisdom and might, and has made known unto me now what we desired of thee. For thou hast not made known unto us the king's matter. Daniel blessed God. He had sevenfold praise. This would be slide number 18, John. He praised God for wisdom and might because God is omnipotent. He's all-powerful. He's all-powerful. He praised God because He changes times and seasons. God makes history. God has determined history. History isn't stuff that has happened. History is stuff that God has determined would happen. It's His story. He moves kings and sets up kings. He has authority. Nobody rules anything without God's permission. That means even the evil ones, even the wicked ones, God has a reason. He gives wisdom unto the wise and knowledge to them that know understanding. He gives knowledge. He grants that. He reveals the deep and the secret things. He gives revelation to us. Explains things to us. Shows us things that no man could ever show. Reveals things to us things that no man could ever reveal. He knows what is the darkness and the light. He's omniscient. He's everywhere. He knows everything. He's all-powerful. This is the God of Daniel. This is why Daniel would not be defiled with the king's meat. He didn't want to miss out on what God had for him. Now, had Daniel not chosen to do that, he probably would have lost his head with the other wise men. But God answered his prayer. Verse 28. Verse 27. Let's just back up. Arioch, verse 25. Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste, and said thus unto him, I have found a man of the captives of Judah that will make known unto the king the interpretation. The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, that was his Babylonian name, Are you able to make known unto me the dream which I have seen, and the interpretation thereof? Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, The secret which the king has demanded cannot the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers show unto the king. But there is a God in heaven that reveals secrets and makes known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. You see, there's a lot of people who want to sit back and try to interpret this. We don't have to because Daniel interprets it. What Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream dealt with the latter days. It dealt with world order. It dealt with the times of the Gentiles. It dealt with world power as concerns the city of Jerusalem. From Nebuchadnezzar till now. That's what Daniel said that dream was about. That's what he said it was about. He says, Thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. And in verse 29, he says, As for thee, O king, thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed, what should come to pass hereafter, and he that reveals secrets makes known to thee what shall come to pass. He said, Nebuchadnezzar, you were sitting back, thinking about your kingdom, wondering what the future was going to hold. Well, God's going to show you what the future is going to hold. And he says, as for me, Nebuchadnezzar, this secret is not revealed to me. I don't have any wisdom. This is something I've dreamed up. This isn't some interpretation I've managed to conjure up. But this is an interpretation coming from God. You ever get something from God that you know is from Him and not from you? Did God ever give you wisdom about something you know didn't come out of your mind? Daniel wasn't taking any praise on himself. He says, this secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have more than any living, but for their sakes that shall make known the interpretation to the king, and that you might know the thoughts of your heart. Daniel says, God wants you to understand what you were dreaming, Nebuchadnezzar, okay? See, that's the very practical part, but we're going to get into the prophetic part. The practical part is if you want God to use you, just like we said last week and the week before, you need to make a decision you're not going to defile yourself with a king's mate. The closer you get to God, the more He can use you. Daniel was given the interpretation of this dream. Okay, go to the next one, John. Here's the dream. Here's what Daniel says in verse 31. Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. A statue there. A great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. The image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. And you can see that picture of that statue. Okay? Let me get my point of what I do. That's all right. He says, go to the next slide, John. Thou sawest till a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Now, the artist here made it a flaming stone. Daniel doesn't say that, but it was a stone. Go to the next one. Thus was the iron and clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, and no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So here was the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. He saw this great shining statue. And all of a sudden, this stone came out of nowhere and destroyed the statue, and just completely obliterated the statue. Well, we come to the interpretation. It's a pretty frightening dream, if you ask me. We're going to find out that this statue represents kingdoms, powers. Listen to what Daniel says. Verse 36. This is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. Thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory. And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven has he given unto thine hand, and has made thee ruler over all. Thou art the head of gold. Go to the next one, John. The head of gold represents the Babylonian kingdom. Now, there were kingdoms before Babylon. There were kingdoms on other parts of the world. There were Oriental kingdoms on this continent, and in South America and so forth. There were peoples and kingdoms. But we're talking about kingdoms dealing with Jerusalem, Babylon. From about 606 to 539, particularly Nebuchadnezzar. Now, Babylon existed before that. But we're talking about King Nebuchadnezzar. In Babylon, the king had absolute authority. He didn't have to answer to anybody. What he said was law. And if he wanted to change it, he could change it. He could do anything he wanted to do, and there wasn't one counselor or one lawmaker or one cabinet member that could do anything to change his thinking. He was the only one. He was the absolute head of his kingdom. What he said was law. End of story. Okay? Now listen to what Daniel says. Go to the next one, John. Verse 39. And after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee. The second kingdom was the Medo-Persian Empire. We're going to read about the fall of Babylon in Daniel chapter 5, where the Medes and the Persians conquered the city in one night. Their kingdom lasted from 539 to 331 BC. And in their kingdom, their king was subject to laws. When we read the story about Daniel in the lion's den, you know, the king passed a decree, and according to the law of the Medes and Persians, he couldn't undo his decree. Nebuchadnezzar could change his mind in a minute, and nobody could say anything about it. But the Medes and Persians had laws that the king, even the king, was subject to. So we see, going from gold to silver, silver isn't as valuable as gold, is it? Still pretty valuable. It's not as valuable as gold. Okay. Daniel goes on and says this. Go to the next one, John. And he says, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. Speaking of the Grecian kingdom, under Alexander the Great, from about 331 to 30 BC. Alexander was a general, and he was subject to his generals, and Greece also had kind of like a democratic form of government. We know that after Daniel died, his kingdom was split up amongst, he had 4 generals, and eventually it fell into the hands of 2 generals, the Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucids of Syria. Okay, but again, we see brass isn't worth as much as silver, certainly not worth as much as gold. We see again an inferior metal, an inferior kingdom, because while Nebuchadnezzar was the absolute ruler, the king of Medes and the Persians, they had some restrictions. Daniel, he was subject to a lot of other influences in his reign. And finally, the third one, go to the next one, verse 40. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, forasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and subdues all things. And as iron that breaks all these shall it break in pieces. This fourth kingdom was the Roman Empire. We know that the Roman Empire, it existed before 30 BC, but it really came into prominence about 30 BC. And while the actual Roman Empire found its demise around 400 years after Christ, we still really live under Roman laws and Roman rules, and the influence of the Roman Empire is great, particularly with Roman Catholicism, the Holy Roman Empire. These things are still in existence. In the Roman Empire, we know that there was a Senate. The people of Rome elected their leaders. The empires were chosen by generals and so forth, and they were subject, to rules and so forth. So we see a deterioration from gold to silver to bronze to iron, from Babylon, absolute autocracy, to Medes and Persians, to Greece, to Rome, a decline, a deterioration in the government, in human government. Okay? They deteriorate in value. Go ahead to the next slide. They deteriorate in value, and they increase in strength and rigidity. Because how many people know gold isn't a very strong metal? You're not going to build a tank out of gold. Right? It would cost too much to begin with, but gold is very malleable. Iron, of course, is just stuff that man makes. Put a bunch of steel together and make iron. That's very strong. You're not going to make a sword out of gold, because it would just get banged up. You make a sword out of what? Out of steel. The steel is strong. It's not worth as much, but it's more powerful. We see a deterioration in value and an increase in strength and rigidity. Go ahead, John, to the next one. He describes his fourth kingdom. Now, when we go to the chapters where Daniel gets the visions of the 4 kingdoms, okay? Daniel doesn't spend a lot of time on the first 3. But he spends a lot of time on the fourth one, the Roman Empire. Because the fourth one is the one that's really going to be here at the end. When Jesus comes back, well, let's read a little bit. He says, and the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, for as much as iron breaks in pieces and subdues all things, and as iron that breaks all these shall it break in pieces and bruise. And whereas you saw the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. Now, we see the 2 legs on that statue, the 2 iron legs. There was a Western Roman Empire and an Eastern Roman Empire. The toes, there were what? There were 10 toes. Well, there were 10 toes. They represent 10 kingdoms, 10 kings. Listen to what he says. As the toes and feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And whereas you saw iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. This fourth kingdom, go ahead, John, to the next one. The Roman Empire. A lot has been said about the Roman Empire. They were arguably the strongest empire on the face of the earth for their time. They controlled a major part of the world at that time. And they were brutal. It was like an iron machine that would come and just conquer nations. They were strong as iron, breaking to pieces. But it says that the 10 toes were made of iron and clay, partly strong and partly brittle. Well, what's that about? The 10 toes represent 10 kings or 10 kingdoms. Do you know that there are 10 kings in Europe today? There are 10 kings. 10 monarchies. Let me put it like that, because there are some queens and kings. There are 10 monarchies. We think of England, but there are others. There's Denmark, Holland, Sweden. Some of these nations, tiny little nations, where they're monarchs, you wouldn't even think of them, but they're very wealthy. And they're very powerful. Don't ask me to name all 10, because I can't remember what they all are. But there are 10 kings. Or are those going to be the 10 kings? I don't know. I can't say that. But there are 10 kings in Europe today. And what we see in Rome, it was a monarchy, democracy, socialism. How many people know what socialism? Socialism. I was talking with somebody, or having an email discussion with somebody about socialism. I can't remember what it was. And somebody was saying, well, socialism is good. I said, do you want to know a good example of socialism? One of the prime examples of socialism in the last 100 years? Nazi Germany. The National Socialist Party, or the Soviet Socialist Republic, the Soviet Union, Communist Russia. People talk about socialism. Socialism isn't about, they think socialism is about, taking care of people. That's not what socialism is about. Socialism is about control. Government control. Okay? Control. This last kingdom, Daniel says, it's going to be, I'm going to read that again. Verse 43. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. But they shall not cleave one to another. I believe that this final form of the Roman Empire is really what we're seeing today in what we call democracy. And so isn't democracy a good form of government? Not in God's eyes. Because, that very last thing I have up there, you see how it says that in quotation marks? That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Do you see that? You know where that comes from? Where did you say? Well, consent of the rich, but do you see where it says consent of the government? That comes from our Declaration of Independence. That's a quote of our Declaration. They're saying exactly what Daniel is saying right here. Mingled with the seed of men. Where in the Bible does it say that the governments get their authority from the people that are governed? Governments get their authority from God. Nebuchadnezzar, we go back to the head of gold, the pure autocracy. Nebuchadnezzar got his power from God. God called him my servant, even though he was a heathen king. He didn't answer to anybody. He didn't realize he was answering to God. Eventually he did. God showed him. But now we're living in a time, these times we're living in, where what are we trying to do? We're trying to market, we're trying to export American democracy. That's the thing now. From our revolution, from the American Revolution, until now, there has been a move in the world. Ours was like the first great revolution. Major breaking away from one nation from another. After ours came the French Revolution, then the Communist Revolution, in Russia and China. And what were all these revolutions about? They were about power to the people. Huh? That's what they want you to think. But like John said, that it's really almost like they're just making you think you got power, but the ones who really are pulling the strings are the guys that got the money. Let's just make everybody feel like we have something to say about it. Okay. I'm not going to go too far on that. Because we might be here for a while. Okay. They want you to think we all got to vote. I believe in voting. But you know what? This world system is controlled by the evil powers of this world. And they're only able to do what they can do because God is allowing them until His time comes. Because if you go, to the next part. John, go to the next. Verse 44 of Daniel. And in the days of these kings, in the days of these 10 kings, of the feet, of the toes of clay and iron, in the days where the powers of government mingle with the seed of man, in these days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom. Jesus is coming back. In the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. You see, what Daniel saw 2,600 years ago is happening right now. It's happening right before us. If you have eyes to see and ears to hear, we're seeing this world coming to a place of the absolute rebellion against the God of heaven, just like at the Tower of Babel, at the beginning of the city of Babylon, when they all were with one speech and they all with one accord began to build this tower into heaven without God. We're back there. We all speak one speech. We might not all speak the same language, but you get on a computer and you can talk to anybody anywhere. All with one accord. We live in a world today where I don't know if we have one world ruler that really cares about what God thinks about anything. It's about power. It's about control. It's about economy. It's about money. It's about controlling people and populations and so forth without God. I don't care what they put on the money. I don't care how much they say, in God we trust, God bless America. They don't care. We're living in the time, in the latter days. We're living in the 10 toes time right now. You see it around you. Jesus Christ is coming back. I don't know how much longer He's going to let it go. I don't know how much more He's going to let happen. You know what they're trying to do? They're trying to create life forms. You know what I'm saying? They're trying to create new life forms. They've learned how to, they've gotten, mankind is so, created in the image of God. We're so brilliant. We have such an intelligence. They say we're related to monkeys. I don't understand that, because monkeys swing in trees and eat bananas. Mankind is trying to figure out unraveling, genetics. And what they want to do now, they want to create different life forms. Brand new ones. They want to take the place of God. And you know what? Just like they were building that tower, God said, if you go back and read that, God said, you know what? They're going to do whatever they want to. Mankind will do whatever He sets His mind to do, eventually. But God's going to intervene. There's some areas that we're not allowed to go. And He's not going to let us. We're treading on thin ground, thin ice right now. God's coming back. Go to the next one, John. The destruction of this world kingdom, the destruction of this world order, the destruction of the times of the Gentiles is happening. It's going to happen. It's lining up right now. And the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords is going to return with the Word of God coming out of His mouth. Revelation chapter 19. He's going to come back and establish His kingdom. And all the kingdoms of this world, the head of gold and silver and bronze and iron, will be blown away like chaff. The kingdoms of this world will become the kingdoms of our God. The psalmist said, who is this King of glory? The Lord God Almighty. See, Daniel saw this 2,600. Isn't it exciting? We're living in that time. We're living in the 10 toes. Daniel didn't have a clue about exactly how this was going to go down. He didn't know what the things were going to be in the world. Daniel, really, he only spoke about, as we go further in Daniel's prophecy, and he talks about the saints, he's talking about the Jews, the Hebrews. Daniel wasn't given a vision of the cross. He was given a vision of the history of his people before it happened. And how God's going to reestablish. He's going to establish His kingdom, His earthly kingdom, in Jerusalem. When Jesus comes back, he's not going anywhere but Jerusalem. And he's going to establish his throne, and he's going to plant himself there, and he's going to be in charge. Hallelujah. He said, when you see these things, look up, for your redemption draws nigh. It's the end of time. Man's trying to fix everything. And he's just making everything a bigger mess. It says, when they shall say peace and safety, then comes sudden destruction. The Bible talks about a war between a war with Russia and Iran coming against Israel. My goodness, Russia is sending nuclear fuel to Iran right now to build a bomb. Oh no, for a power plant. Jesus is coming back. We're living in this time. This prophetic stuff, how can we say the Bible's not from God, Chuck? He's telling us things that are happening that we see, that we read about in the paper every day. Go to the next one, John. Well, just reading verse 44, 45. In the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all the kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. For as much as thou saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it brake in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter, and the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof is sure. You can bet on it. What Daniel said. You can bet on it. Nebuchadnezzar, when he heard the dream, when he saw that God revealed to him his dream and the interpretation of his dream, the king, the most powerful man on the face of this earth, fell on his face at the feet of this young Hebrew boy. Daniel might have been 20 years old at the time. Here's the most powerful man in the world getting on his face because he realized that he heard from God. He commanded that they should offer an oblation and sweet odors unto him. Verse 47. Then the king answered unto Daniel and said, of a truth that your God is a God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, seeing that you could reveal this secret. Then the king made Daniel a great man, and gave him many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. Then Daniel requested of the king, and he said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, his friends, over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat, and he became like the second in command, a Hebrew captive that they tried to make into a Chaldean. They tried to turn him into one of the other Chaldeans that couldn't get the dream. Because he purposed in his heart, he was made second in command. Now I thank God tonight that we have these words. That God has made known to us what he's going to do and what he's doing. See, this is why I've said before, a lot of people say, well, why study prophecy and this? You know what? We need to study prophecy to understand that nothing is happening that God doesn't know about. He wrote this book, he wrote this story a long time ago. So where should we be? We should be like Daniel. We need the purpose in our hearts. We're not going to defile ourselves. Well, there's so many ways you can defile yourself today. You can do it when nobody's looking. But God help us. Make a decision. Because you know what? Things are happening in the world. Listen. They're not going to get better. How many people know it's not going to get better? In the world. I heard somebody say one time, people go, old J. Vernon McGee. I don't know if you ever used to listen to J. Vernon McGee. I used to listen to him all the time. He said people would come up to him and ask him, do you think things are getting better? And he'd say, yeah, things are getting better. We're getting closer to the time of Jesus coming back. And they come up and they ask him, well, you think things are getting worse? He said, yeah, things are getting worse. They're getting worse in the world, but the worse they get in the world, that's the closer we are to Jesus coming back. So when we see all this stuff happen, listen, I pray vote, do what you need to do, help, do things, do all these things, pray and ask God for wisdom and all this other stuff. But just know this much. The closer, the worse we see things getting, the closer we are to Jesus returning. John said in the end of Revelation, even so come quickly, Lord Jesus. He said that 2,000 years ago. We're saying it today. It's going to get worse before it gets better in the world. But the worse it gets out there, the better it gets like this. Because I want to tell you something. When you lose your options in the world, that's when you turn to God. That's when you turn to God. And God can do things you can't even imagine. He'll give you interpretation of dreams. Make you second in command. So he did with Daniel. Daniel's exciting. Next, all these chapters in Daniel, especially the things that he endured. Next week, we're going to read chapter 3. How many people know what that's about? Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar worshiped the God of Daniel. Daniel chapter 3, he built a statue of himself that he wanted everybody to worship. It's not until chapter 4 that he finally came to his senses, but when we get there, we'll talk about it. All right. Praise the Lord. Any questions or comments before we close?